All right. Hey, folks. I made a post on my Instagram just covering my first proper gym routine and how I gained my first 20 pounds of muscle. And the post got some traction. Okay, got a lot of questions, both on Instagram and also via my coaching group. People were interested. Within that first year of proper training, I'd gotten to the point where I was benching almost 2 plates a side, squatting over 3, and deadlifting almost 5. And so it gained some interest. And I think it can be useful for you guys to know how I got from being a complete beginner to where I am now, which I think is sometimes more helpful. It's more helpful than YouTubers and influencers giving their ideas about, hey, this is optimal. This is what the latest study says. Whereas this information is actually what I did. What did I actually do to gain my first 20 pounds of muscle? And bear in mind, this was back in the year 2000, 99 to 2000. So it was way before we had all the latest studies on volume and failure and everything. What I'm talking about is actual real results. So I want to kick off with that today. And I know you guys like it when I speak a bit of history. So I want to give you guys a bit of history as to my influences up until that point. Okay. So let's just take a trip back in time. Now, I often say my first year of training was the year 2000, but actually I had been training for a couple of years prior to that. I've been training at my home gym and also a local fitness center. At my home gym, we used to pick up plastic weights, plastic sand-filled weights from the local Argos. And when we got too strong, we'd have to go to the Argos on the weekend, spend our money, get another 10, 20 kilos worth of weights and lug them back on the bus. So in those early days, I was just doing some basic stuff at home. Now, at about 1999, I signed up for a local rec center. So when I went to this rec center, I couldn't bench 20 kilos. I specifically remember there was no equipment there to actually squat or deadlift. The bench was just on a machine, an old universal machine, but they had a lot of cardio equipment. Essentially, the room was just full of cardio equipment with one large universal contraption in the middle where you could do different exercises. It was probably about the same size as the room I'm in now. So at that point, I was very overweight. So I was 210 pounds and I was just fat. So I was at college, 17 years old at college, and the goal was for me to drop some body fat. At that point, I'd started to count some calories. So this was before the days of MyFitnessPal. I had a calendar in my bedroom with squares for each day. And what I would do is I would write down my macros for each day on the calendar. And that's how I was assured that I was in a calorie deficit, because I'd read about it. There was some information online. So within that year, 1999, I ended up dropping 50 pounds, mostly via a combination of calorie counting, but I was doing a lot of cardio, something like 45 minutes of running on the treadmill, and then maybe half an hour of weights, and then another 45 minutes of running, which I think I was doing anywhere between 4 to 5, maybe 6 days a week. I can't quite remember. So I was very young at the time, 17 years old. Now, back in the late end of 1999, December time, I was playing football with my friends and I bust my ankle again. So at that point, when I was a kid, I just had quite weak ankles because I was so overweight. I rolled on my ankle, right? So it was strained. So I was sat there and my elder brother, he dumped a load of bodybuilding magazines on my lap and said, "Here you go, read this while you're bored." So I said, okay. I had a read and I was reading the magazines and I came across some good information. Back then, the information was pretty reasonable. So I was drawn to Yates because it seemed like he was talking sense. Not because of his physique. I didn't really know that much about bodybuilding. And to be honest, I wasn't really that interested in bodybuilding at the time, but I just thought, this guy is making sense. So it wasn't just Dorian, it was some other guys at that time as well. Some other low volume natural advocates. So guys like Mark Oakes, Dave Goodin, Ian Duckett, they were all talking sense at the time. And I settled upon buying this book. The book was called Brawn, and it was by a guy called Stuart McRobert, who was also in the same vein of low volume advocates. And my first routine I put together was a sort of a combination of all of these guys. And it was a very low volume routine, just a basic upper lower. But the influence that I got from all these guys was amalgamated in that routine. I wasn't at this point completely sold on what Dorian did. Not because he was training too hard, but he was doing things which I felt were unnecessary for me. Because he was doing things like cable pushdowns and leg extensions, things like that. And I thought in my 18-year-old mind, I thought to myself, maybe I don't need that stuff. Like, that's Dorian Yates. He maybe needs to do isolation work for his triceps and for his legs. I'm me. I just need to gain some muscle. So I did some stuff from Dorian, but without the fluff, what I consider to be fluff, if you can imagine that. So my routine was really very basic, and it was a reflection of what a lot of those British natural bodybuilders were doing at the time, like the guys I just mentioned, because there's a long history of these guys with great physiques on the British circuit who all valued low volume, high intensity training. And this was completely separate from Dorian, completely separate from Mike Mensa. So don't get this confused. I don't think a lot of you guys know that history. And I've never really spoken about it before. I've spoken about Dorian, but yeah, those were the influences. There were a whole rash of these just really hardcore underground British guys, all natural, who valued really hard training with low volumes and high efforts. And they had great physiques, all on the natural circuit. They weren't heavy, they weren't big guys, but they looked tremendous when they were in shape, and they were all natural. So that was my early influence. So in that year of 2000, let's now go on to things that I did right. Okay. So in that year, I set up a routine, which is an upper lower routine, and it was super basic. And I want you guys to pay attention to this, because for some of you guys who are not yet at the stage that I got up to at the end of the year 2000, which was a 90 kilo bench, a 150 kilo squat, and a 210 kilo deadlift. So that's what I got within that first year of proper training. And they're not world beating numbers, but my point is, those are pretty decent numbers for 12 months of training. For a lot of you guys, you wouldn't have hit those numbers even after, say, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. But that's the crucial part of this video. That is the crucial part of this video. I want you guys, if you listen to anything in this part 1 series, I want you to listen to this, which is, we didn't care about volume back then. We didn't care about the arguments about training to failure or not, intensity versus volume. That's all nonsense, because it's all secondary to adding weight to the bar. Poundage progression, okay, so progressive overload, progressive tension overload with good form in moderate to high rep ranges, that's the only thing that matters. It was back then, and it is now. All these arguments we have about volume and intensity, those are all there to facilitate more progression. And I think that's something which has been lost over the last 25 years. I really do. And yeah, there are exceptions. And if you clean up your form, you can lower the weight and carry on growing, sure. But if all else being equal, if today you are benching a plate aside for 12 reps with perfect form, and a year from now, you're benching 100 kilos, 2 plates aside, for the same form with 12 reps, you're going to have grown. And it doesn't matter what volume you did. The volume was enough. And I think that's something which has been absolutely forgotten over the last 25 years. And I would like people to focus on that a little bit more than they currently are, because there's far too much discussion about optimal volumes, and there's not enough discussion about adding poundage. And also, there's way too much discussion on little minor details, things like length and partials, squeeze, stretch, all that kind of stuff. All of that's irrelevant in the face of more weight on the bar with equal form in moderate to high rep ranges. You can have the perfect form with the greatest range of motion, length and partials, all that stuff. If you're not adding weight to the bar, you're not going to grow. And I really think when people argue so passionately about their one belief of the volume or the intensity or the form, they don't realize they're doing themselves a disservice, first of all, okay, because they're focusing on a 1% issue. But if they're an influencer, if they're a coach, they're also doing their audience a disservice as well, because it's more about progression than it is about what else you're doing in the gym, how you get there. If you're able to progress doing 20 sets versus if you're able to progress doing 6 sets, I don't care. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people are very obsessed with getting just the right amount of volume, high volume, more obsessed with that than putting weight on the bar. And a lot of times that is holding them back. So the volume that I did was mega low that first year, but I didn't care because it was enough to get the job done. And as a result, I grew and I grew. It's really important. I really hope if you take nothing from this video, like that point, it just is drilled into your skull. because that will save you so much wasted time, more than anything. Probably the most important thing you'll hear today on YouTube. So anyway, that routine that I put together was an upper lower, and I'm going to talk about it more in a second part, but the basic gist of it was this. I would alternate 4 different routines. So the upper routines were like this. I had bench press, bent over row, and a dumbbell press on one upper day. And the other upper day was a weighted dip, weighted chin, and seated barbell press. Those were my 2 upper days. So one was biased more towards overhead pressing and vertical pulling, and the other one was biased more towards horizontal pushing and pressing. Okay, but that was it. Arm work was not really in the routine. I just did it every now and again, not every session. But those were the heavy basics, and I would do 2 sets per exercise. Both of those sets were in the 6 to 8 range. Just heavy weights, minimal sets, sometimes just 1 set, and fairly low reps, 6 to 8. Now, the lower body days, the first one was the squat, so the full squat alongside the partial deadlift. So what you guys might refer to these days as a rack pull, I would refer to it as a partial deadlift because it was a partial deadlift, right? So one day was squat and the partial deadlift with some calf work. And the next day was more of a leg press day. So I would do leg press with a full deadlift and then some calf work. Okay. Now, the deadlift I was doing at the time was a sumo deadlift, and then I would do the rack pull conventional style because that just made sense. And I know there's a lot of jokes about the sumo deadlift these days, but to be honest, the sumo and the regular conventional deadlift are very complementary to each other. The muscles that the sumo doesn't work, the conventional does, and vice versa. So it was a good choice to alternate those 2. Now, in terms of how often I was training, this is what you're going to laugh at. I was training usually 3 times a week. Every now and again, I might train a 4th day, but just 3 times a week. So that means, in terms of volume per body part, let's just work it out. So I would do 3 sessions of upper over 2 weeks, 3 sessions of lower over 2 weeks. So every body part would be worked 3 times over 2 weeks. And it would be a total of around about 6 sets. Yeah, across the 2 weeks. So you're looking at 3 working sets per body part per week, usually. Sometimes 4 if I train 4 days a week and I did upper lower on both days. So that was what got me to a fairly reasonable status. 16-inch arms. Yeah, I had some body fat on me. The point was I was a big 18-year-old and I'd grown a lot. I'd gone from being essentially fat and just really in poor shape to then being skinny to then being pretty well built and having built my first 20 pounds of muscle. And I was young, so my body fat distribution was quite good. And yes, I had some fat on my arms, but the point is I was big, I was shapely, I was strong. And it was a great base. It was that first 20 pounds of muscle done with an extremely basic, extremely low volume routine. Funnily enough, there were lots of low volume approaches back in the early days. The funny thing I remember was they all seemed to be at loggerheads against each other. So you had HIIT, like Dorian training. Dorian's training, you had Mince's training, you had dog crap training, you had hard gainer training, you had all this whole British scene of training, which didn't really have a name, it was just training. But they all were fighting against each other. So dog crap was rebelling against HIIT training, didn't like to be associated with HIIT. And HIIT didn't like to be associated with hard gainers, and hard gainers didn't like to be associated with whatever else. But with the benefit of hindsight, they were all very similar. They were all just under that umbrella of high intensity, low volume routines. It's just funny looking back because they all argued with each other, saying, well, we're not like this, we're not like you. But actually, they were all a departure from the super high volume routines which didn't work. And those were mostly from the drug culture, enhanced bodybuilders. At that stage in the late 90s, enhanced bodybuilding had really just taken over bodybuilding. Because you've got to remember, the 90s were a weird period, right? The 90s were when bodybuilding was still underground, so it wasn't mainstream. And as a result, there wasn't as much mainstream drug-free information out there. It was just very underground, very based around enhanced bodybuilding. In fact, I specifically remember the reason that I got into powerlifting rather than bodybuilding was because I didn't really see much of a natural bodybuilding scene in the UK, and I didn't want to take drugs. Maybe it was just not a very well advertised, but I just didn't see it as an option. So that's actually one of the reasons why I went towards powerlifting, because I felt like I could do that naturally, and I wanted to compete in something. So it was going to be one of the two. And I think this is really where the misnomer around powerbuilding came from. And maybe this is the reason why I've gone against powerbuilding so much, because in my point of view, all the training that we saw coming from the enhanced ranks, the 70s, 80s, 90s, that was all from enhanced bodybuilders. It didn't represent bodybuilding. To me, bodybuilding was low volume, essentially just heavy work on the basics: squat, deadlift, bench, overhead press, rows, chins, dips, all that heavy stuff. To me, that was just bodybuilding. That's what I was taught. So when I first heard the phrase powerbuilding, I thought, you're just trying to put a name on something which already has a name. Didn't make any sense to me. Because in Britain, that was what we were doing. We were just grafting on the basics. That's how I was taught how to train. As I say, my first routine was literally just squats, deadlifts, overhead presses, bent over rows, benches, dips, chins. That's all it was. So that's all I knew back then. So I felt like bodybuilding as a whole had gotten lost in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of fluff that was being added into routines, mostly from enhanced bodybuilders. But to me, that was just enhanced bodybuilding. It didn't reflect what I was doing, what I was interested in. Yeah, let's move on to talking about Dorian and Dorian's influence, because as I say, I was heavily influenced by Dorian because he was local to the area that I lived in, which meant everybody was a Dorian advocate. Now, do you know what it's like when you're a kid and you're rebellious, right? Because when I was a kid, this town that I grew up in, and it was a town back then, it wasn't a city. It's only been made into a city later. But this town that I grew up in, it was just a small town. And like every kid from a small town, I wanted to get out. Yeah. So as soon as I could, I left home, I went to a big city, I got educated, and I traveled the world, right? But in the beginning, I didn't want to be here. I just wanted to leave. So when I went to the gyms and everybody was talking about Dorian and Dorian training, I rebelled against that. Yeah, I was influenced by it, of course, but it's like when your older brothers do something and you have to do something different. I was trying to find my own way. So I was looking more towards these guys like Ian Duckett, Ian Gooden, Brooks Kubik. I was looking towards their influence. I wasn't trying to be influenced by Dorian, because everybody around me was, Dorian's amazing. And yeah, he was great. Like, I'm a huge fan of Dorian, but if you grow up around that, you want to rebel. So yes, I did have influence from Dorian, but I had influence from a whole bunch of British natural bodybuilders who all valued low volume, heavy, hard, basic training. That's the answer to the question of when did I get the Dorian influence? I got it right from the beginning. That routine was Dorian influenced. It was just a style of training. We all did the same stuff, low volume, high intensity, but don't be fooled. That is not the exclusive property of Dorian, just like it's not the exclusive property of Mensa or Arthur Jones. There was a whole history, a rich tradition of British bodybuilders who all did hard, heavy, basic training. And that's my influence. That's where I'm from. But anyway, people blame Dorian quite a lot for ruining bodybuilding in a sense. So he's the guy who people say played the mass game. Now, what I will say in his favor is he also elevated British bodybuilding in the limelight. And so what he was doing with low volume training was all within that realm of just hardworking, gritty UK bodybuilders. And he brought that to the world stage. A lot of people blame Dorian for the size game, but he was responsible for putting a lot of people on the right track. And once you dug into Dorian, then you also saw some of the other guys that I mentioned in this video. And there is this whole rich culture of British hardcore low volume bodybuilding, which is what I grew up in. That's my roots. That's my history. So that was my first initial routine, and that was what was responsible for the first 20 pounds of muscle. Now, this video is actually going to be the beginning of a series of training, evaluations of that first year or two of training that I did, because in hindsight, I can look back at all the things that I did, and I did a lot of right things. And I want you guys to follow along. because you can learn something from this as I teach you the things that I did which were right, and also potentially how I could improve. I hope you found that introduction to my history interesting. And this video series is going to be all about how I gained those 20 pounds of muscle. No conjecture, no theory, no studies, all me, what I did to gain those 20 pounds of muscle, what I actually did. And I think you'll gain a lot of value out from it. So until the next part, see you guys soon.